So just as a little recap, we're talking about the journey of the soul, and when the sun hits the ascendant in your chart, it is the start of your personal solar year. So you listening, if you're unsure where your ascending sign sits in the 13th sign astrology, then you can hit us up for a chart. The link is in the description below. So the first house, when it is the house of personality, how the world sees us. The second house is the house of resources. It's in the more of the earthly house. The third house, governed by Gemini, it's sort of communication, and I think it's important to note that the way we communicate now in our adult life very much is dictated how we learned communicating as a child, both by the people in our lives and the way we were able to express ourselves. Then the fourth house is the home life and lineage, and the emotional part of our soul. Its guardian is the moon. And that brings us to the fifth house. So how does the Ophiuchus energy play in the fifth house?
Yeah, so I like the way you put that. So we have the journey of the soul for all of us, which happens every time the sun hits the ascendant, as you say. And each of these houses is the field, if you like, through whichever sign is in those individual houses, because it'll be different for each person. That's the background. That's what's going on in the background. So the Ophiuchus energy, just to recap, is that the Ophiuchus frequency or insight or integration goes with any house. So it doesn't matter which house your Ophiuchus falls in. I mean, for you it's the first. For me, I think it's the seventh house. All of us can draw upon this really powerful, I call it super intelligence, feminine super intelligence, to help us in respect of the house in which Ophiuchus exists. But we're talking here about a lunation where the sun is an Ophiuchus, so the sun's energies are amplifying whichever house of yours is the house of Ophiuchus. And the reason we're going through the houses is to give some basic understanding of if Ophiuchus is in your first house, for example, then you're dealing primarily with the issues of personality, the way the world sees you and the way that you see the world. If Ophiuchus is in your second house, you're dealing primarily with issues of resources and skills. And as you touched on there, they're physical. The third house is, that house of learning and communication. And so Ophiuchus will amplify or help you to be a better communicator, or to learn more effectively, or to unravel some of the knots that may exist in your life that go back to childhood, as you mentioned, where you may have had some learning difficulties or challenges. And that fourth house, yes, that it's obviously quite a complex house. We spent quite a bit of time talking about that. It's the repository of soul. We often say in our podcast that the moon it captures all of our existences that we've ever had. So when people talk about past life regression, they're really talking about accessing that fourth house, the fourth house of knowledge, the fourth house of experiences that are stored within the archetype of the moon. So the fourth house is very important, especially if you have an Ophiuchus energy in that fourth house. And it's interesting too, when you look at those first five, the ascendant, the first, the second, the third, and the fourth, you've got personality, you've got physical, you've got intellectual, which is that communication house, and you've got the emotional. So you've got all aspects of the human experience are tied up in those first four houses. So we get to this fifth house, which in a perfect, starting at Aries, if the ascendant starts in Aries and a 12-house system, then obviously the fifth house is the house of Leo. So the first thing we know about the fifth house is that it is a fire sign. Therefore, its predominant focus is action, as opposed to the preceding house, of emotion, which is predominant focus, is going inward. So the Leo house is absolutely about outward activity and expression. I call it the house of creative expression and play. And when we think about play in the context of this discussion, one of the ways that we can develop ourselves is to play games. And Leo is one of those houses where, if we're going back to the childhood experiences, that many of us played games, and we were talking about this last night. Whether it be formal board games or card games or other types of games, say organised sport, or whether it was playing on your own in your room with a Lego set, or with a doll set, or with a doll house, or with a chemistry set, or whatever it is the natural human state to play. And this is where we access that energy of that natural alignment with our creative impulse, which is actually the ability to play. And I was thinking about this, good analogies of games would be things like, if you put 10 people in a room and gave them all a huge box of Lego, but they were all walled off from each other, but they were all in the same room, and even they didn't even speak the same language. And then you say, create whatever you want to create. You would get 10 different people. Let's say for this experiment, they spoke different languages, different cultures, and had absolutely no relationship with one another. You would see the most incredible creativity. You would see all sorts of creations come out of that. And what that little story there illustrates is that the power of the fifth house is that of creativity, but creativity is rooted in a sense of playing. In the business world, they call this experimenting and learning. They call it having sprints, where you take, or innovation is the word, the classic word. They take a problem and they deconstruct that problem in a very methodical way, and then they'll put it back together. Kind of like there's no single way to do a Rubik's Cube. There's various ways to play Jenga. There's lots of different ways to play games like Monopoly and cards. And I'd even go deeper than that and say there will be people with an Ophiuchus fifth house of play and creativity who are masters at creating games. You know, in reflecting on what I was going to say about the fifth house, I would pose the question, and you know, the Gen AIs will tell us the answer, but I don't know the answer. But it'd be very interesting to know where the game of cards was created. That feels to me like a Ophiuchus fifth house expression, because there's a game that is one, universal, two, transcends boundaries of language and culture and sex and age and anything and everything. It is a universal language, playing. And we can think of other games that are universally, doesn't matter where you are, games like chess, games like checkers, you know, and there are various games. Who created these games? And what was the purpose of them? If we are to be creative, if we are to access our most creative self in that fifth house, then the key to it is to learn how to play games. One of the things that, for me, about Leo that is misunderstood is that people focus on its spirit animal, which is the lion or the lioness. And it's a very powerful motif. It's a very common, you know, people see the lion or the lioness as the apex predator, the king or the queen of the jungle, if you like. But yes, that's a part of Leo. But to me, the deeper part of Leo, and where you will access that if you are an Ophiuchus fifth house, is in how do you play? How do you understand the games of life? You could be a master at interpreting, you know, the games of family dynamics. You could be a master at interpreting the games that happen inside businesses that hold businesses up and that keep businesses from performing. There are so many ways of looking at this house of creativity and play, but to me, that fifth house is linked to, there's two sides of the coin. Yes, this creative expression and that outward expression of our creativity, but the way to develop that is to learn how to play, or to remind ourselves how to play, or to go back into our childhood and think, what were the things that I used to do that gave me the most joy when I was just playing, whether it was with my brothers or sisters or on my own or with kids next door. And often right there is the answer to part of how we develop that fifth house fully. Because in essence, a lot of us have forgotten how to play, especially as adults. We get so wrapped up in our busy lives that when push comes to shove and when we're under pressure, we don't go to playing with something and thinking about it differently or deconstructing that situation. What we do is we immediately revert to the intellect, or we go and exercise to try and get rid of the stress, or we eat to try and suppress the feelings that we've got going on, or we go and listen to music or do some distraction. And this is why those first four houses are very interesting, because when we've forgotten how to play, we draw upon, and sometimes we'll go to that physical house and we will say overeat, because we're so stressed, where the answer is actually to play with the situation, to be creative, to look for a way or a different solution, but we will overeat, or we will overthink the Mercury house, or we will overfeel that house of Cancer. So that fifth house is really pivotal in the journey of the soul through the soul, with that solar year for each of us individually, beginning in that ascendant and moving through to the fifth house. And just to be clear, the fifth is also the opposite of Aquarius. Now that's interesting too, because if Aquarius is where the big ideas come from, and we know that 11th house, which we'll touch on a little bit more when we get to it, but suffice to say that to have big ideas, you have to know how things work, and you get to know how things work by playing with them, whether it be systems, whether it be card games that teach you the principles of, games like poker teach you a lot of principles. One of the things that I love to do sometimes is watch sports channels like ESPN, turn the volume off and watch World Series poker. It is one of the most fascinating games known to mankind. But right there, without having the auditory and the commentary, just letting it speak to you, you will learn a lot about the human dynamic. And this is what I'm getting at, is that the house of the fifth is the house of play and creativity. But it teaches us so much, not only about ourselves, but about how we deal with the world.
And creativity and creating is so important, just like playing is, keeping that playfulness. But there's many spiritual people that have that message of keep creating. We are here to create, and some of us create with the traditional sense of artistic way, whether it is sculpting or painting, and others are creating databases and just making new things, and so for me that very much goes hand in hand. Be playful in the creativeness of you, and do what speaks to you most. Don't feel forced that, oh, my mum is an artist with sculpting, therefore that's my only way I can be creative. But that's absolutely not true. You could be creative in the garden, you can be creative with, as I said, with databases, with writing, and keep that playfulness there. So thank you. The sixth house, traditionally the house of work and well-being. We did a big blog about that because the solar, one of the eclipses was in there, so we spoke a lot about work and well-being. Traditionally the guardian is Virgo, so the Ophiuchus energy there is that transforming the way we look after ourselves physically, or our well-being in a way.
Yeah, it's to do with well-being, but like the house of creativity and play, there's always a flip side to well-being. Where do we derive our well-being? Well, we get it from a couple of places. The first thing is that the sixth house is an earth house, so our well-being in this context is linked to our bodies and our physical surroundings, and so we can draw and derive a great deal of satisfaction by arranging our environment to suit us in the best way that allows us to be creative, that allows us to be responsive to whatever it is that comes to us. So the well-being in the physical sense of the sixth house is linked to our environment, but it's also linked to our health and what we consume. and how much sleep we get and how much water we drink and so on and so forth. And so there's that huge part of well-being is linked to the physical, but there's another side of well-being, which is the different aspect of Virgo house is work. And what do we do, with ourselves that gives us meaning? You see, the sense of well-being, as I interpret it, is deeply, deeply tied to our sense of meaning that we derive from work. Now, work in this context is not necessarily paid work. It could be any type of work, but it's doing something that isn't spectacular, but it gives us a sense of satisfaction. And it also provides us, in my experience of Virgo, it provides us with a sense of accomplishment, as small as it may be. Something that I'd like to do that I ascribe to Virgo energy in the work and well-being is the dishes. I like to do the dishes. I like the physical experience of cleaning, of seeing a mess on the bench and then tidying it up and putting it into order. And that ordering and that comes from that is very much Virgo energy, because when we think about the guardian or the say ruler, as they say, of the Virgo house is Mercury. Well, Mercury is all about order and logic and systems. And so when we think about order and logic and systems in the context of our physical environment, our physical bodies, and the way we work, this is why often you'll hear Virgo described as people who have strong Virgo energies are good managers. They are very good at organizing things and putting things into their into almost a systematic, process-driven approach to things. And that may be that you have a way of eating, a way of exercising, a way of arranging your environment. Again, what do we do? Some of the things that we do in the morning, we've got beautiful doors that we can open, and I come through often and say feng shui, and I'll open the doors because I want the energy to flow. That's part of that whole arranging your environment. And each of us are different. Some people will have plants in their environment. Some people will have freshly cut flowers. Some people will have art and flowers. Some people will have, all sorts of arrangements. That physical experience is also tied, of course, to the second house. The second and the sixth are very much linked because they're two parts of that earth. You've got the Taurian earth, which is the resources. But if you think of it like this, I gathered the resources to cook a meal in Taurus, and then I'll cook a beautiful meal and arrange it in Virgo. So that's how those two houses are linked. Now, the Ophiuchus energy here again as the integrator is profound because it helps us to organize our environment. That energy will give us insight into our health and well-being and what drives that. And as I said, one of the dangers for human beings is that if we are not working on something, even if it's just a hobby, if we are not occupied, then we don't necessarily experience the amount of well-being than if we are busily occupied. And I don't mean overworking, I mean just that nice balance of, I keep myself occupied with working on something, whether it's for an employer, whether it's for yourself, or whether it's in the home, or whether it's in a volunteer situation. It doesn't matter what the context is. And as I said, I'd be clear that the work is the basis of well-being because it provides meaning for us. And we are wired to look for meaning, and we need a sense of accomplishment. So if I was to link those first six houses, we've got the personality. In the first house, we're learning how to use our resources. In the second house, those resources in this context of work and well-being would be, how have you looked after your body, and what skills have you developed physically, so that when you get to that sixth house, you've developed your personality, You've developed your skill set in the second house. You've developed your communication skills in the third house. You've developed your emotional intelligence in the fourth house. You're bringing some creativity, creative spark in the fifth house. By the time you get to the sixth house, you're a pretty well-rounded worker. But equally, if we're not working well, or our well-being is out of sync, if you like, the Ophiuchus energy will help us to almost look back at that. There's many ways, but it gives us those insights and say, what is the root of that? Is it a physical thing? Is it your environment? Is your environment supporting you? Is your diet supporting you? Or is it the work that you're doing, that you're not deriving enough satisfaction, enough juice from it? And maybe that might be a tweak in, I love my job, but I've forgotten how to be creative. Or I need to work on my communication skills. Or I need to be a little bit fitter because I'm having to walk around outside. Or carry the kids if you're a stay-at-home parent. Or I might need to develop my emotional intelligence. Or I might need to refine my personality. So there's a beautiful sequence of how these houses all come together. And when we're talking about Ophiuchus insight, it's always helpful to think what came before in order to see what maybe is going to come afterwards as well.
Yeah. And that's, when you first told me about these houses and how it's a journey of the soul, and those first 6 is very much the I. How do I go through these houses? And then when we get to the 7th, the house of commitments, contracts and commitments, it is where I become we.
Yeah, and I developed that model, if you like, of the houses, having spent 40 years in astrology systems, learning it from all sorts of angles, including the 12 sign, the 13 sign, the Vedic systems, the I Ching systems, the East, the West, all the different perspectives. I've put it all into the melting pot, and the best way for me to explain almost the hemispheres as well, because if you look at the circle and it cuts in half at this 1st and 7 axis, and if we look at when we talk about the 7th house, we're talking about the direct opposite of the ascendant. And so the 7th house is what they call the descendant. And the way I explain that or describe that when we're doing readings or when I'm reflecting on it is, if the 1st house is your public face, then the 7th house is your private face. And you're right. The way we talk about that is the journey of the soul, starting with the solar, with the sun, activating your ascendant. And like we said before, if you don't know where your ascendant is in the 13 sign system, it's very important to understand that, because each of us has a different 12-month experience of the solar. Your partner will have a different experience of the solar cycle if their ascendant is different to your ascendant. And unless it's exactly and precisely in the exact same moment, which would be unusual, even family members and people you live with, it's unlikely that anyone has the precise same ascendant, because it's so timed on the moment of birth. So that means in a household like ours of 4 people, that each of us have a different solar year and therefore a different experience of these 7 houses. So this 1st house of the public face, the personality, and like you say, we go through all of these different other houses, and in the 7th, the I becomes we, and the we is in the context of relationships. So many people will associate that 7th house of Libra with the house of balance. But the balance in this case is a balanced relationship. And it is a relationship, firstly, with yourself, where you learn to take all of those experiences of what I would call the ego development. The ego development from the 1st through to the 6th house, you've successfully mastered how your personality and how to work with people. In other words, you've got a good, strong sense of social IQ is your 1st house. That's what that would look like. Ophiuchus first house would be you have a really strong social intelligence. You know how to read the room. You know how to communicate with people. You know when to listen and when to speak. You know when to give a hug and when to give a growl. You know, because you've developed that first house. And in that second house, you know how to manage your resources. The third house, you know how to use your intellect and your mind. That fourth house, you know you've developed your emotional intelligence. In that fifth house, you've got this great sense of play. And in the sixth house, you're deriving an enormous amount of well-being from the work that you do. And by the time you bring all of that into the seventh house of relationship, wow, you are ready to intermingle with another. Now, the nuance and the subtlety that we talk about in our podcast about that seventh house, and the reason we call it contracts and commitments, is that it's not just a romantic relationship we're talking about. It's any closely tied, significant relationship. That may be with a business partner. That may be, if you're in a small business, it might be your boss. The sense of, when I describe it as contracts and commitments of the seventh house, it gives a much broader context for how those relationships form. My dad once said to me that, being in a partnership, which I was when I was 17 through to about 27, me and another bloke were in a business partnership, and that partnership broke up. He said it's like when you break up with your business partner, it's like going through a divorce. He said it's very similar. So, the notion of the seventh house, I becomes we. The we is your ability to compromise, your ability to find balance. But of course, all of that is drawing from those first six houses of experience. If you are out of alignment in any of those houses, then it's likely that you're going to bring conflict and angst and anxiety into your seventh house relationships. So, of course, an Ophiuchus energy there is vastly important in terms of discerning how to firstly construct a significant relationship. As I said, being clear that this may be a business partnership, or it may be a romantic partnership. But the way we construct that in terms of both the implied and implicit agreements between us as to the way we behave, the roles that we play, the hats that we wear, all of that is determined by how effectively we've navigated through those first six houses. You think about, if you've got a strong sixth house of work and the other person's got a strong sixth house of work, then how are you going to balance that? Because you've both got that energy. If one's got a strong second house of resource management and the other doesn't, well, then you can see how that seventh house can very easily work together. But what comes to mind with the seventh house Ophiuchus also in terms of energies is this would be the house of an amazing negotiator, or a guidance counsellor, or a relationship counsellor, or a psychologist. Anybody who has that ability to understand two sides of an argument, or where friction may be coming up. You see, we call upon external parties, or we draw into ourselves when we are in conflict. So this would be the moment the Ophiuchus energy would express itself in a seventh house, is in the moment of conflict, in the moment of disequilibrium, in the moment of imbalance within those seventh house relationships. And the key would be, a good counsellor would go back in a spiritual sense and would say, okay, let's have a look at how you have developed those first six houses. Let's have a look at how your personality works, your resource management and mindset works, your communication and intellect works, your emotional intelligence works, your creativity and play works, your work works. And line those two up, and right there you would have the seeds and ingredients for a pretty amazing Ophiuchus counselling session, if you like. So it's a very powerful, all of these houses are powerful because Ophiuchus is the quintessence, the ether, as we talked about, the power the undefinable power. But in the context of relationships, and how many relationships go stale, run into problems, and those that have ever gone through counselling, whether it be business counselling or marriage counselling or couples counselling or guidance, know the value and the worth in talking to somebody who has a great understanding of the human condition. That's probably a 7th house Ophiuchus energy right there.
So many beautiful gifts you carry, all this knowledge, sharing it with us. Thank you. So after this beautiful 7th house of contracts and commitments, we go into the 8th house, which the guardian of the 8th house is Pluto. It's Scorpio. It, people might go, oh my gosh, that's darkness, but not necessarily. How would you, first give us an overview of that 8th house energy, and then how the Ophiuchus energy helps.
Well, the first thing to note about the 8th house is that it is going to be a small house, because the house of Scorpio, or the constellation of Scorpio, as you know with yourself, only takes 7 days for the sun to move through. So the Scorpio energy is, on that basis alone, is highly concentrated. If we were to think about it from the concept of alchemy, then Scorpio ingredient into an alchemical process would be, you wouldn't use very much of it, because it is so potent and so powerful and so transformative and so overwhelming that if you were, it's like the little jar or the little elixir that you're making something, you make remedies and things, or people are chefs would be a great, or they're in the garden and they're fertilizing, you wouldn't use very much of Scorpio, because it's so powerful, and its reputation is well forged in the idea of how do we describe it, as the deep space or the deep waters. So even on this planet, even with the amazing technologies that we have developed over all the time that humans have been here, the current version of humans, 10,000-15,000 years, the DNA is dating back. With all the technology over that time, we still have not probed the deep space, and we certainly haven't probed the deep waters. So right there we have an analogy to understand Scorpio's power. Pluto and Plutonic energy is related to, in many people's minds, atomic energy, because the atomic energy is so powerful on the one sense as a driver of energy and giver of energy. And if it's well structured, there's no problem with it. But equally, it's incredibly destructive, as we know with the war, with World War II, with the dropping of bombs on Nagasaki and Japan. Incredibly destructive power. Pluto as a planet sits at the very outer reaches of what we consider to be the Milky Way, the omniverse, the metaverse, whatever you call it. And we have probes that take forever to get there, and by the time they come back, there's just so far, but yet we're still aware of that Pluto energy. So Pluto is incredibly powerful in so much as it is an energy that is, we need to confront it and deal with it. And there are people who associate Pluto with the darkness, the deepest, darkest, most profoundly disturbing side of humanity. And whether we like it or not, there are some people who are able to go there, particularly artists, and draw upon those really terrible experiences that most of us that are in the human consciousness or the collective unconsciousness, and bring it back in a way, usually through art and creativity, television, acting, writing, books, art, that allows us to digest that aspect of ourselves. A key to Scorpio is not to disown it, but to own it. But to own it, you have to be able to confront the depth of emotion that comes with it. There is no doubt whatsoever that the Scorpio energy, and therefore the energy of the house, of the 8th house, is going to be dramatic. It is going to be profound. the way that we talk about Scorpio is we refer to the Platonic path. Or the Scorpio teaches us that there is 3 steps to changing your situation and circumstances. And the first part of that is you must transmute negative energies, you must transcend beliefs, and you have to transform belief structures. So Scorpio is very systematic in that way, insofar as, as many people talk about, don't want to go. I once heard an expression when I was learning about Scorpio that says a lot of Scorpios are murdered, or they're involved in criminal underworld, or they have criminal minds, and this sort of, and that may well be true, because they are able to go to the depths of human soul and go where nobody else dares to tread, but actually go, well, actually there's something here that I need to bring light to. So Scorpio Ophiuchus energy, like any of the water houses, and I talked a lot about Ophiuchus and the moon. Well, this again is another water energy. This is even deeper. If we're talking soul memories, Ophiuchus moon, or the 4th house, in Scorpio we're talking about the collective memories and the collective trauma that is existing in humanity, the traumas of war, the traumas of conquest, the traumas of the great floods, the traumas of Tiamat being destroyed, if you believe that, the traumas of the Atlantean cataclysm, the traumas of Lemuria, the traumas of all sorts of things that have gone on in human history are in that Scorpio reality. That's the big picture. But there's a smaller picture with Scorpio as well. And let's bring it back to the individual and the journey of the soul. So 1 to 7, I becomes we. Well, when we dissolves, it dissolves into that 8th house of Scorpio. So I describe the 8th house of Scorpio as also the house of entanglements and encumbrances. Because when a we relationship of 7 dissolves, it can be absolutely messy as you can imagine. And it can transcend timelines. Literally, grandma passes away and the kids are fighting after she's gone. Right? So there's an example of the fighting over what was left of her we relationship. And it's karmic for that reason. I believe that Scorpio house is full of karmic resonances. Anything to do with the water signs, whether it's Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces, is that we are dealing with quantum realities. We are dealing with parallel past selves that exist in other realms or other aspects of self, because that sits outside the linear timeline. And therefore, whenever we're talking about the water houses, whether it's this 4th house of the repository of soul, or the 8th house, the repository of entanglements and encumbrances, those entanglements and encumbrances that we need to transmute, transcend, and transform may be coming from another timeline. They may be a trauma that's been passed down from 3 generations ago. You may have somebody in the lineage that went through the Holocaust, that went through some of these absolutely dramatic events, and it is contained in their DNA, and that is coming through the genetics. And this is what I mean about encumbrances and entanglements. So it's so multifaceted. We could spend a lot of time talking about Scorpio, but suffice to say that with Ophiuchus and Scorpio meet, it's arguably the most profound place for Ophiuchus to be in terms of unraveling the human unconsciousness, whereas the 4th house is your unconsciousness. So this is another level altogether. So Ophiuchus 8th house, you may have somebody there who's absolutely expert at understanding not only history, but everything that's not been written about history, and all the subcurrents and subterranean parts of what's not spoken. Often history is written by people who don't want us to truly know the darkness. Well, a Scorpio Ophiuchus 8th house person will be somebody who's quite comfortable delving into all kinds of things that most of us would steer away from. And that includes even things like, what is at the bottom of the ocean? You know, what life is down there? What the heck is it, astrophysicists? What is out there at the outer limits of where our technologies, we can send probes into space? Is that as far as it goes? I don't think so. So, you know, a very complicated house, a very interesting house, and, you know, I would love to meet somebody who has an Ophiuchus 8th house and really hear about, if they're living that, really hear about how they interpret Ophiuchus energy and what is one of the most complex houses of them all.
Yeah. So if you have your Ophiuchus in your 8th house, hit us up, drop a comment, an email. We'd love to talk about that one.